All right. We have made it to the end of another book. And oh, there's Clay. Perfect timing. So I know that our chapter for today is short, but this is nice because it will give us a chance to talk about the overarching narrative of this book before we jump into the next one. I will say I have planned out the rest of the year's Bible study. It took me a little bit last week, so I have it all laid out. I will put it in a nice printable format for you all. So we have just literally the rest of the year taken account for. So expect that later today. But for now, let's turn. If I can get on the right page, that is. Let's turn to the end of the book, chapter 31, where we finally get the battle between the Philistines and Saul that we've kind of been leading up to. A reminder of last week, David was gonna fight with the Philistines. He was gearing up for it, but the Philistines said, "We don't trust this guy," and so they sent him home. He went on a rescue mission, and so David's out of the picture for this last chapter. And instead, we get everything from Saul's point of view. So, just to get ourselves off the ground, what did you all think of this final chapter here as kind of the conclusion to Saul's narrative?
Well, it's kind of sad in some ways. It's Saul has fought the good fight and didn't want to let go, and the Philistines really wiped them all out. It's really wiped them out, and he and his well, what did they call him? His armor bearer, fell on their swords because they did. Oh, that was sort of interesting. Saul said he didn't want to be killed by somebody who wasn't circumcised. I think that's kind of weird, but I would think anyway. So, what do you think? I'm curious about that. Why would he not want to be killed by somebody who's uncircumcised?
Well, they just used that, didn't they, for a non-Jewish person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then it would be, he could sort of say it. He didn't do it.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
So I'm gonna write that down. We're gonna hold on to that thought, and we'll circle back to it. So why be killed by someone other than the Philistines? Why be killed by someone who is circumcised rather than uncircumcised?
Yeah.
Well, the Philistines weren't circumcised.
Nope.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was just the same as saying he didn't want to be killed by a foreigner.
Yeah, it is. There's more there is other implications there, which is why I said let's put a pin in it. There is a wider discussion. But what are some other initial opinion or initial thoughts, initial reads?
I think he was afraid they would kind of make fun of him, that the Philistines would if they killed him, and that they wouldn't treat his body well.
Mm-hmm. And they didn't.
They didn't.
Yeah, they didn't.
And actually, it was sort of, the Lord had told Saul, "You're going to lose the kingdom. David's going to succeed you." And the way this is done, which is very gory, but there isn't any question. Saul is not deposed; he's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So this ends the Saul story once and for all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
he may have wanted to be buried in his own place too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he took control of what happened to him.
Mm.
He didn't let the Philistines after he was dead, they took his body, but
yeah, so thinking about what it means to have agency, even in the way that someone dies, which is something that I feel like is still hopefully not in as gory of a context, but it still has implications today of what does it mean to be able to be an agent over one's own death. right, I'm taking notes here. Any other initial thoughts going into this? All right, so let's start to walk through some of this because there are some while I will say it is a very short chapter in some ways for the amount of build up to this battle, it just says there's a battle. Like, we don't get those extended fight scenes. We don't get like all the back and forth, the Hollywood. What matters are the characters here. But there are some interesting moral questions that that do arise here that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the morality, especially around topics of death, because we tend to steer away from it. And some of the traditional teachings that we see in Christianity, we have a chance to discuss them and why I don't think a lot of them are accurate. So let's dive into the story. So chapter 31, verse 1, we jump right into it. The Philistines fought Israel, and the men of Israel fled. So whatever is going on here, evidently the Israelites were just did not have the forces. And it's pretty clear early on, because Saul is nervous, that Saul knew that they didn't have a good chance, which is why he went to the Witch of Endor, which is why he tried to talk to Samuel. The odds were already against them. And so what do you think of both Saul, who was going in scared, going into this situation, knowing the odds are against him, knowing that his buddy Samuel did not have a good fortune for this, but he still shows up.
Mm-hmm.
The army still shows up to what they think is a losing battle.
Mm-hmm.
What does it take to show up even if you think you're going to lose?
A lot of courage.
Yeah, courage to the end.
Well, he was still the king and the leader.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think he was thinking that this would be a good way to end his life? He knew he didn't have any future. I don't know. Was it suicidal?
I don't know.
We don't know. We don't know.
Not enough textual evidence to say one thing or another.
Yeah.
But Saul did take his own sword and fell upon it, so it is suicide.
Yeah,
That
hold off on that. We'll get to that. But for the moment, let's just linger on the fact of they're showing up. And they at least, even though the armies eventually run, it sounds like they still line up for battle. They're still going to give it a go, even when the odds are bad.
They're not going to make it easy for the Philistines. Maybe they think they might have some say in what happens in the battle, even though they're going to lose it. I don't think they would want to have the Philistines take over their territory either. They don't want that, but they know they can't avoid it probably, but they're going to try.
Yeah, since we're not a culture, I mean, the wars that the United States have been in have often been, or in like recent memory, they've all been overseas, they've been out of sight. So often our best parallel for battles like this is actually sports games. And so part of me thinks about, like, what does it mean to show up to a game? Now, granted, these aren't life or death situations, but you know the other team's better than you are. And I've been on teams where if like it was very clear the other team was just far better, you kind of just give up. and you don't play your best. You're kind of already defeated. And then I've been on teams where it's like, you're going to have to we know you're better, but you're still going to have to claw out each point you get against us. What does it take or when do you see, or like, have you seen this either or situations where you kind of show up with a defeatist attitude and you get defeated versus we're going to be a cantankerous bunch, even if we're going to lose? Yeah, Larry?
Yeah. And every once in a while, the underdog wins.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always that possibility. As bad as the odds are, maybe this is one of those times.
Mhm. Yeah.
But there's not much here that tells us that they fought hard or there was
Oh.
any
No.
there's not much discussion about the battle at all, except the interesting thing is the archers I can envision where if all at once they were confronted with 1,000 archers and they got close enough, they just weren't prepared for that type of an attack.
Yeah.
That is one of the signals, actually, that the Philistines were just a better military force, period, is because archery is not just a skill. Arrows are actually very expensive to make. I've heard before historians say that you actually had to be quite wealthy to be an archer because a single arrow would be the price of a normal foot soldier's yearly salary. Just because of what it takes to create a straight shaft, to carve little arrowheads. Arrows were like, that's why you then went and collected your arrows after the battle, is because they were very expensive to make. And we haven't really read about the Israelites having archers, which shows that it's one of the like subtle hints that the Philistines are probably wealthier and have more military practice, and they have more elite types of warfare on their side, because this is forgive me if I'm wrong, this may be one of the first times we've seen archers mentioned in the battles in the Bible. So it's not that the technology is unknown, it's just expensive. But to your point, Gary, you're right. There isn't much to say about how the Israelites showed up, how King Saul showed up. I still think in my book at least, it's still a mark in his favor that Saul still showed up. Because there's other people that you can read about later in the Bible, they don't show up for battle. They know they're gonna lose, and so they flee. Theoretically, Saul could have just left, abandoned his kingdom, but lived. But he chose here to show up and die. And I do think that says something. I have always been trying to show that like Saul wasn't all bad, and I think this is the one last piece where you see Saul is at least a decent king because he's willing to show up at least. But we get very quickly that yes, the Philistines were a stronger force this time around. They overtake Saul, and then without much pageantry, we see that the Philistines kill Jonathan. So that's the first death that we get. We get Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. And so those are the three eldest sons of Saul, who are just taken out by the Philistines. So by the second verse, what are you all feeling? Oh no, like they showed up for battle, Philistines overtook them, the three sons of Saul are dead.
Right, yeah.
And it felt like this is it.
Yep. And we've already read about Jonathan. Like Jonathan, who evidently was this great, like he was a great soldier. We saw him infiltrate enemy camps. We've seen him take out companies of people single-handedly. And it felt sad to me just to see him fall in a single verse. Like he just all of a sudden he's gone. So are you at all thinking about what's gonna happen when David finds out? Because now Jonathan is like his best friend is gone. So the battle presses on. We don't get the story doesn't lighten up with this pressure. The archers find Saul, so they're able to get him at a distance. We don't quite know whether Saul is back, kind of like directing things, or if he is like in the melee with his sword fighting. We do know Saul was a warrior king, so there was a chance he was in the melee. So he gets hit by a sword, and then that is when he asks his armor bearer, strike me down, don't let him get me. So if you are mortally wounded, why is it still a good idea to have your right-hand person take you out? Why would Saul request this in this position?
He didn't want to be captured alive.
Why is it bad to be captured alive?
We're going to torture him.
Yeah.
And they might display him, which would be dishonoring.
Right. So, I mean, you have torture, you have dishonor. So he can die with his honor intact. Or, I mean, who knows what they're going to do? The horrors of war are nearly unimaginable, and he's been in war. He knows what he's done to kings. We've seen when he kept them alive for reasons. He knows what can happen, and so he's like, no, I'm down, take me out now. Why would the armor bearer not want to? Because his armor bearer says, no, I'm not doing that. Nope.
Well, he's taken an oath to protect the king. He can't turn around and kill him.
Well, the chapter says he feared greatly. What he feared.
So that's my question. What would the armor bearer fear in this situation?
Maybe that he would.
Maybe the Israelites will
strike him down or something, or he would be. I don't know.
He might be accused of murder.
Yeah. Maybe the Israelites will win. What's going to happen then when they find out that he's killed Saul?
And so there's two angles of that the notes kind of talk about. One is the fact that Saul is the divinely anointed king of Israel. He doesn't want to kill God's anointed one. Because that's not just, so there's the angle of it could look like a military coup, and it could look like an Israelite took out the king on behalf of the Philistines. So there's one where he doesn't want his legacy to be the traitor that killed the king. But there's also the divine angle of he doesn't want the responsibility of Saul of killing God's special king on his conscience. He doesn't want to meet God and say, oh, oopsies, I killed your king. So there's human retribution, there is divine retribution. The thing is, I don't think this guy is he doesn't think he's going to make it out alive. So I think in some ways it's preserving his legacy. And even then he's like, I'm not going to kill the king. Like, what? Are you crazy? So at the point where he even stutters and is like, no. Saul decides to have the agency in his own death. And we have a euphemism that is used frequently that Saul falls on his own sword. And so that kind of brings up this question of how does the Bible talk about taking one's own life? Because there's a lot of ways that religion has interpreted taking one's own life. And I know there's a lot of Christian teachings, but let's talk for a moment about what the Bible actually says about it. So what have you all heard, or like growing up or throughout the church world, how has suicide or taking your own life been talked about in the past that you all have heard?
For Catholics, I think it's a sin, isn't it? you can't be buried in a consecrated cemetery or
Mhm.
something like that. I don't know.
That was true for early
Okay.
Protestants as well. That wasn't just a Catholic thing.
Okay.
Like the Puritans did a very similar thing.
Okay.
Other other teachings that you have heard, other ways of understanding this. Has it been talked about much in your, or have you heard people talk about this much, or is it one of those it's so taboo we don't even discuss it topics?
Well,
Well,
there's often a shame attached to
Mhm.
a suicide.
mhm.
Yeah, sometimes I think they leave it out of obituaries. They just don't say.
Oh, yeah. You know, for years and years, the Journal of the American Medical Association printed the death, you know, whenever a member died. And they always included the cause of death as noted on the death certificate. And if it said suicide, they published suicide, you know.
Mhm.
Well, then I forget somewhere about 30 years ago, they quit doing that.
Hmm.
They didn't want that sort of private information to be disseminated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always struck me is weird. You know, when someone commits suicide, it's obviously they're suffering. They can't face life anymore, and to punish them for that is seems so cruel.
But there seems to be a shame in suicide.
Yeah, yeah, there is. Yeah.
So to give you a little bit of background with how I approach this subject, it has always been a semi-open topic of conversation because my aunt committed suicide when my mom was still in college. And it's just one of those things that in one side, it kind of was a hush-hush topic. My aunt was she was either a junior or senior in high school. And so it was one of those that like, it was very shocking. But I always grew up knowing about this, and my mom talked openly about it. And so it was never like it was told to me in a way that like society has shame around this. But I grew up in a world that if you don't give it that shame, then you can talk about the situation around it, and you kind of take the taboo and the the boogeyman out of the idea, which is why I think it's helpful to talk about it because, as has already been mentioned, there's a lot of mental health things tied up into this, which has changed since my aunt's time. That was one where like my grandfather did not want to talk about it. He did not want things published. He didn't want crying high schoolers at the funeral. Like it was one of those that it was kept very under wraps, which seems a shame because that means we never got to talk about the causes. But it also means that we kind of ignore statistics, because I often find that when we think about suicide, we often think about the tragedy of teens, which is the demographic my aunt fell into. But one of the things, if you look at the actual numbers, one of the highest rates of suicide are by older men, especially in rural areas.
Mhm.
Where it is then talked about is these older men, especially in farming communities, when they feel like they've lost everything, they actually use the term that's in the Bible of they fell on their own swords.
Mhm.
Whether it's getting into debt, trying to preserve their farm and it not turning out, whether it meant they had to sell their farm and they didn't know what to do. It is a particular problem when especially their spouse, their wife is no longer alive, that there's a lot of very lonely, very desperate older men who die by suicide. And it is seen of desperation and depression. And it is sad to me that there is a demographic in need that because there's a taboo subject, we don't talk about it.
Mhm.
And we don't talk about it often because of the very traditional notion that suicide is an unforgivable sin.
And if you read in the newspaper that some 80-year-old farmer died, you don't pay any attention, you know. But when you read in the newspaper that an 18-year-old girl died, you know, I mean, I look, oh, I wonder if she committed suicide.
Mhm.
And I look to see, well, what does it say about her death in her obituary? If, they ask for donations to the Leukemia Society of Michigan, it's pretty obvious. But if they don't say anything, there's always that feeling,
Well,
that suspicion.
yeah, they used to, if it was cancer, they used to leave that out too, but that's not so true now, I don't think.
More, no.
Yeah.
No.
So to go through, or I'll start with what's actually in the Bible, and then let's talk about what's not in the Bible when it comes to this subject.
Mhm.
So when it comes to what's in the Bible, there's basically two things that people have extrapolated from, which I don't think is necessarily fair. The first is one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not kill.
No.
And as we talked about when we were going through Exodus, the Hebrew actually says thou shalt not murder. And so it has a very technically, some people say that war isn't counted into that commandment because murder and like battle war are have different verbs, and this one is very much like do not go to your neighbor and kill him. But it is very much a like one person does something to another person, but it's often interpreted as human beings do not have the right to take human life, whether it is someone else's or your own. It's basically life and death is God's domain. Therefore, it is bad to even have that or take that over yourself. In which that is an interpretive step. It does not actually say that, but that is one interpretation of that. And I think that's important to know that, if people want to take that step, it is a logical step, but you have to know that you are taking that interpretive step, is what. The other one is that I've seen quoted, I did a quick perusal on the internet. The other one that comes up is in Deuteronomy at the end, where Moses has given them the blessings for entering the promised land and the curses if they do not do what if they don't follow the life or they don't follow the law. And at the end, Moses says, I set these before you, life and death, choose life. And this exhortation to like choose life and don't choose death is often applied to this situation of people should always choose life over death, which is what makes suicide bad, is because they are not choosing life like Moses said. But if we see once again, that is not what it's referring to is choosing life by following the law, not as it doesn't directly apply. Once again, it is an interpretive step that you can take, but it is an interpretive step. Other than that, there is nowhere in the Bible where it directly addresses taking one's life being good or bad. The rest of them are just examples. And we have a lot of examples of people taking their own life, of falling on their own sword. We have Samson pulling down the columns to kill a bunch of people and himself. The one that is kind of considered a cursed act is Judas. After betraying Jesus, it does seem to say like he is a cursed man. There is many reasons why he would be considered cursed, but one is considered taking one's own life. But that said, it is why Christians tend to say it is an unforgivable sin. is never spelled out in scripture. And the logic is that you need to request God forgive your sins. And if you are dead, you can no longer request forgiveness. And so basically you die with sin because you have committed a sin and never been absolved of it. But the Protestant faith in particular says that like God forgives all of your sins for all times. Like the confession is for our benefit. Our baptism is what washes us clean of all past and future sins. So by our theology, that doesn't actually apply, especially when our modern understanding of taking into account like mental health and long-going health struggles or other things, we see that it's not as simple as like someone being weak-willed or someone I hate the term like they're taking the easy way out. They are not.
No.
Not at all. And so it's one of those that the idea that it's an unforgivable sin just does not match what scripture says or Protestant theology. And so I'm curious what you're all's thinking about this is kind of knowing that there's not really much. You can take some scriptures and apply them, but they are interpretations. Otherwise, there's actually not really much about it. What do you all think?
I think if I applied that to myself, if one of my daughters committed suicide, if I felt like she was ill and I'd given her all of the help that I could, etc., I think I might feel okay, but I would feel guilty and personally responsible.
Yeah, by assigning it a sin is actually, you could see it as emotionally trying to place blame somewhere. Like people often want there to be a reason and blame. And if you feel guilty, sometimes people are uncomfortable feeling guilty. And so they put guilt somewhere else. And so that can be seen as one way is like, oh, I can't be guilty. I don't want to be guilty. I feel guilty. So I'm going to assign guilt somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
And while everyone would agree you shouldn't kill somebody else, when it comes to killing yourself, unless you've been in that situation, so forth, it's hard to understand what drives people to do that, the anguish that they get. When Jean's mother died, my father-in-law contemplated suicide. He had a family revolver, and he wrote a note, and then he just decided he couldn't do it, so he didn't do it. And we didn't discover this until after he had died, which he did 4 months after my mother-in-law died. And his doctor said he died of a broken heart. And I think it was true, but he was going to shoot himself, and you just can't understand how that can happen, but it does, and it must just be horrible.
Yeah.
I think of suicide as sort of an incurable disease that really nobody can really do anything about if someone is really contemplating it. I think that the pain is so great sometimes that we can't understand, but I do think that it's certainly something that if a person is determined, then it's sort of an incurable disease. You just can't do anything about it. It happens. And also, I think people who are in the throes of death and having terrible pain, an extra dose of morphine is certainly called for.
Some of the the shooters that kill a lot of people and then kill themselves, I think they see that whole thing as a suicidal thing, but they're going to take people with them. So it's, you're not going to survive something like that. Either you're going to kill yourself or somebody else is going to kill you. So, I mean, they always get caught. They pretty much always get caught.
Yeah. So the good news.
Sometimes they're very angry. And some suicidal people are very angry.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're good. I thought you were done. That's all. The good news is a lot of interventions by talking with people who attempted suicide, but they were like found in time or it was reversible. Learning from survivors, we've been able to put in interventions that are actually very effective, many of them. I was reading, there was something I believe that was instituted in, is it Wayne County? That they just had a report on, it was like a 2-year program, and suicide rates dropped dramatically. And so it's one of those that suicidality, I think, is one of those things that we have to understand is going to happen. But it is encouraging that targeted programs can prevent that, because it's one of those things that while the person is in anguish, they often don't understand how much they mean to other people. They truly think that people will not care, and that is not true. And people who go through programs are able to come out of that state, which is very encouraging. But Helen, you brought up a secondary point, which is actually where I wanted to bring our conversation as well, is thinking not just about the tragedy of someone taking their life because they're in a hard position or because of depression or things like that, but thinking about having agency in one's own death, especially when you have an incurable disease. I've had to have conversations with my good friend who has MS, and when she was going through the diagnosis process, she didn't know how bad it was, how severe it was. And she was very open that if it is the really bad kind, I'm going to move to a state. And when it gets bad, Chris, your instruction is to help me end it before it gets truly bad. And this is often a conversation with ALS, some forms of cancer, that people want that same kind of agency as in a way that Saul did. Like, they know they're losing the battle. They know there's not a way out. And they would rather go out on their terms than just ride it out through some of the worst parts of these diseases. And so this is where...
Yeah. So it's a control thing. It's because I want to feel like I have control over how I end. Not in a bad way. It's a control has. Yeah.
And I'm curious.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, what do you all think about this? Like, not the... when it is agency over when one dies, when you know you're losing the battle.
Yeah.
Right.
One interesting statistic is that the suicide rate amongst physicians is relatively high. Okay. The thing that is very apparent is that the success of suicide is markedly higher in physicians than it is in the general population, because they have access. They've got access to ways to do it, And should that not be available to all of us? I mean,
well, yeah, Clay?
You're talking about agency. I can't help but thinking about the book Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom, where Maury has ALS and he knows he's going to go through all those stages to die. The stages won't be good. So at one point he says, let's have my celebration of life now. Well, I can enjoy it. Let's do this and not do it later after I die. And so there's a big party at his house. Well, he can still enjoy it. And I don't know why that popped into my mind, but that's one of my people and so agency over his life.
People like, I think that's, and planning your funeral, people do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned the two things, Chris, about dying. I had both things happen within my family. One was an attempted suicide, and she really meant it, but they managed to pull her through it, and she went on to live a long life. And her brother attempted, and I mean, he really meant it. He used a gun. So that was, he really meant, I want to die. So it's kind of odd. I happened to think of it that way after you mentioned that I had two separate ways of handling the wish to die.
Yeah. Yeah, Clay, check your mute. Clay, check your mute.
You're muted. You're muted.
There we go. This just popped into my mind again, things that you've known, but you've forgotten when you talked about an intervention. One of my friends from teaching let us know this shortly after it happened, but it's been years ago now. Her mother was talking to her on the phone and realized how desperate she sounded, and she's talking about suicide. So she just gets on to all her friends and says, keep calling her, keep her on the phone till I can get there. And I thought that was at the time when I read that, I thought, first of all, I didn't know that that's what was going on with this person who has gone on to remarry and just have a wonderful life. But it was an intervention through her mom where she just got everybody, keep calling her, keep her on the phone until I can get over there. So again, interventions can work.
Yeah, it can.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes.
I can't help but think that when Dr. Kevorkian helped people who were terminally ill and was persecuted for it, basically.
Or put in jail.
Yeah, so he is one case where I remember when I first heard him, it was like, ooh, this like Dr. Death, this mass murder, and finding out actually he was helping people die with agency. His one misstep is there, which I believe is where he got imprisoned for, because most of the time he would set up the rig and then hand the switch to people. So he was never the one that flipped the switch, except one time he did.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. And so it was the one time where he actually did flip the switch, which is why he got imprisoned. But once again, thinking about how our culture is uncomfortable with this discussion. And I do think it is because of this longstanding idea of it being an unforgivable sin, which then makes it taboo, which then makes us not talk about it, which then prevents us from talking, like we can differentiate between the suicide of people who are in a bad spot in life versus people who are trying to die with dignity. And so that's why I am a proponent of let's destigmatize it, because there are I am very much in the camp that like I would love people to not have to experience the very end of ALS, which is, I think everyone can say, like, that is torture. But thinking about like, why do we not talk about it? And so anyways, thank you all for journeying into this tough conversation. I always appreciate when you all are willing to journey with me and be open in these conversations, because there's a lot of complexity here. Yeah, Joanne?
I can't help but think that in many cases, end of life, we treat our animals nicer than we treat people.
Right, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It feels like when you put an animal down.
We don't want them to suffer so and continue to suffer.
Well, it still feels like murder to me.
Mhm.
It's terrible.
So with that in mind, there is one thing we brought up before that I kind of wanted to unpack a few more things about Saul's death. Is one of them that came up was, why does he not want to be killed by the uncircumcised? And that is a way to say, I don't want to be killed by an outsider. But there is a sense of shame because uncircumcised people were considered ritually unclean. And if you were to be killed by them, it kind of transfers some of that uncleanliness.
Okay.
So, or like ritual impurity. So he's like, don't let me be killed by an unpure person, because in a way that in and of itself is seen as dishonoring. So it is interesting thinking that in this culture, it is more honorable to fall by one's sword than to be killed by someone ritually unclean. If that shows you how the ancient world kind of thought about this. So he wanted to die with his dignity intact. But there's also I don't want to be treated like a prisoner of war. And who knows what the soldiers would do to him. Yeah, Larry?
But is this not the first documented suicide in the Bible?
Nope. So Samson definitely comes before this. And so Samson, he's strung up. Is it the Philistines or someone else? I would have to go back and check. But he is one who was captured. His eyes were gouged out. He was tortured. And that's one of the things that Saul doesn't want. And then there's like a big party and they have him strung up between two pillars.
Pillars, yeah.
And he pulls him down on himself, which does, even though it's kind of an act of war, it is still considered a suicide in the Bible.
Okay.
And there's another king earlier in the Bible that also falls on his sword in battle. So Saul's not the first one, but I think it's the first main character. No, I mean, Samson's a main character, but it is one of the more prominent ones.
Okay, gotcha.
So.
Well, the Philistines come and they cut his head off. They say, we're still going to have the last word, or maybe that's what they always did. I don't know. And it hung his body up on the wall. I mean, it's awful.
Oh yeah, they're desecrating the body. They are still trying to humiliate Saul. They may not have been able to kill him, but they're still going to desecrate the corpse. And so that's why then when the nearby town hears about this, they sneak in, they take the body, they take the head. This one I was actually surprised by. They actually burn the body.
Yeah.
Which is, generally speaking, in Jewish culture, you don't cremate. But it is a fast way to basically get the flesh to pull away from the bone. So they have the bones left, and bones are much easier to transport.
Yeah.
So what is also one of those things, we don't think about this as much because our death practices are different. When you think about a body being laid out in a tomb, we think of like the mummy that's like kind of wrapped up, or a death shroud tied around it, and they have there's like the plank where you set the body. The traditional death practice is actually a temporary location. You wait till all the flesh is being eaten away or decayed or decomposed, and you're left with the bones, and then you gather the bones and you put that into a nook. So where we kind of have the full scale space where we put we have a casket, you put that in the ground, and that body shaped space in the ground is like that forever. In the ancient world, they conserved space because carving graves is expensive. So they would have gathered the bones after the flesh decayed. So they kind of just sped up the process of like, let's make the flesh go away so we can just collect the bones. And then they take it. My notes say that eventually David does relocate the bones of Saul and Jonathan and puts it in the family plot later on. So Saul and Jonathan are reunited with the rest of their family later on in the story.
Yeah. And monasteries and so forth often had ossuaries.
Yeah.
Where they collected the bones of all the monks that had died over the centuries and put them in one big room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the other thing we see too, and we saw this with the story of David and Goliath, is not only do they desecrate his corpse, they are displaying his armor in a temple. It is a Canaanite goddess where they put the temple, or they put his armor, but it's also, I mean, Saul's armor would have been the nicest set of armor in the military because he's the king. And so they kind of put it out as like a trophy of look at who we conquered. We conquered this king. And the Philistines are all celebrating because in their mind, they toppled a kingdom and now they booted the people from the village and they move in. And so now they are going to reign in the area. So with the last 10 minutes, let's think about the arc of the story here in this book. So 1 Samuel starts with the call with Eli, his sons, and then Samuel's rise to power, Saul's rise to power, David's rise to power, the cat and mouse game, and now Saul's death. So any reflections on that kind of arc of the story here? Of the rise of the Israelite monarchy from the time of chaos and kind of local judges and rulers.
Well, I know that Yahweh was kind of against it, wasn't he? I'm trying to think who was against it. They didn't want, you'll be sorry if you have a king, something like that at one point.
There were factions, there's pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy factions that we see evidence of in the scripture. Samuel was one of those that took it personally when they wanted a king, and he's like, hey, have I not been doing a good job?
Yeah.
And so but you're right, there is that warning of if you get a king, you're not gonna like it. So if we were to give King Saul a rating 1 out of 10 stars, how good of a job did he do?
Well, he had his ups and downs.
Yeah. But I think the idea came about because they kept sinning and then bad things would happen and they'd sin again and bad things would happen and they wanted to stop it in some way.
Monarchy does add, if you're kind of in just like local chiefdoms, a monarchy does both unify an area and add a bit of stability. There are drawbacks to monarchy, especially if you have a corrupt king, but there is a sense of stability that goes with it. So going back to my question though, what grade would you give Saul for being a king?
C plus.
C plus? Okay.
I just pulled that out of my hat.
That's kind of middle of the road. That you're not flunking, but you're also not a straight A student, is what I hear there.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'd give him 2 different grades.
Okay.
I'd give him an A for some military things, and maybe a C for his personal relationships.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe even a D.
Well, I think that I always through this have been supporting Saul pretty much because I felt that I didn't feel that comfortable with the way God was dealing with him. I'd be daring to go to the B plus too, because I don't know, I'm kind of surprised that God allowed Israel to get beat up so bad before he got rid of Saul. It just seemed, I was just kind of uncomfortable with that. We know that Saul was doomed. God had written him off. But it's a shame that the Israelites had to suffer so bad again. I just keep reading too much. Well, Chris tells me you got to read between the words.
Yeah.
I'm blaming Chris.
So, I think that observation is a good one, especially for, we're going to be reading about the monarchy for the rest of the year. But the reality is, the monarchy is a shorthand for the people. And especially when it's kings who have unilateral power or the power players that will be at play, the people are dragged along for the ride, for good or for ill. And so, yeah, Saul's actions have consequences for the rest of the people.
Yeah.
And there are some times where Saul is on a revenge quest, and because he's on a revenge quest, he is not preparing his people for the Philistines. And that could actually be seen as a mark against Saul, is because he was chasing David so much, he wasn't actually preparing for the actual threat.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
I'm thinking about the time frame, though. I mean, we look at stuff in our lifetime. Now, if we spent, and the lifetime back then, you were lucky if you made 40, say.
Yeah. Saul's probably only 40 or 50. He's not too old.
Yeah. So if you spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, you'd think, this life sucks. This isn't the way we ought to live. We should be doing better than this because, and it's hard for us to judge, how, what you should have done.
This reminds me an awfully lot again of what's going on right now in our country. We're all being dragged along with what, that's how I feel anyway. I'm being dragged along with what our president decides and is doing.
The loss of control is pretty scary.
Yeah. Yeah. So going forward, we're going to switch now from kind of we have the story of Saul, which Saul and Samuel have been the two consistent characters. I can't give you an explanation of why 2 Samuel is called 2 Samuel when Samuel is dead. But it's kind of the continuation that of the Saul and David story, but now it's just the David story. One last thing that I wanted to circle back on, the important thing about Saul being dead and not deposed is the fact that David doesn't ever compete directly with Saul. That David only comes to power when Saul is gone, so there is never a question of who is the true anointed king. That question is avoided. So there's never two dueling anointed ones. David waits. And what we will talk about it next time is the power vacuum that happens when a king is dead and your enemy's just won. It is not a good situation that we are leaving off with. But that is where we are heading, is thinking about how David basically comes in and takes control after this situation. That said, next week we are off. I have some continuing ed time, so I will see you in 2 weeks. But you will have the schedule for the rest of the year. I will send that out later today. I will give you a heads up because I thought it would be good to kind of wrap up the arc that we've been journeying through this at the end of the year. In order to accomplish that, we are going to have to move fast. So a lot of weeks it will be reading more than one chapter. When we do this, I always give you the reminder, I'm not going to be going verse by verse through every single, we just don't have time for it. And so I hope you all don't mind that. I thought it would be better to talk about chunks rather than chapters in order to get through to the story, to the end, basically. Sound good?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Wonderful. Any final thoughts for today? All right. Then let us pray. Loving God, As we come to the end of the story of Saul, we always have, or we come with hard questions and moral questions that sometimes we don't always have clear answers to, and we are left to ponder and think about where your spirit is moving and what you are instructing us to this day. We ask you to be with those who are struggling, those who are feeling like there is no way out, people who feel alone and scared. Be with them and show them your love, your mercy, and the way that they can be surrounded by community. Show them an answer to their problems and help the people around them speak into their lives so they don't feel so alone. We also pray for those who know they are at the end of their life, when they know they will not win the battle, when they know that things will be a tough road ahead. Be with them and their families and their friends as they talk about tough questions, where they look for guidance, where they make decisions with agency and with dignity. But also, God, be with us in our own battles. Help us to know that you do not abandon us, that we never have to take on things by ourselves, but there are people around us to prop us up, that you give us community to be there for when we need it most, but that always you are by our sides. So be with us this week as we enter into the difficult story of Jesus's final week, and meet us at Easter when we see that your love will always win in the end. We pray all of these things in Jesus's name. Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
You, Chris.
Of course. Take care.